Good day. A few days ago, I did a program in which I discussed the large-scale naval drills that were taking place between China and Russia in the Sea of Japan, and the way in which these naval drills highlighted the growing cooperation between these two nuclear superpowers, and the fact that they also emphasised or underlined the extent to which these two nuclear superpowers are now in effect de facto allies. I pointed out that the Chinese seem to be increasingly sharing classified information about their top of the line weapon systems. In this case, the Type 055 super destroyer. And I have speculated in various programs that the Russians in return may have provided the Chinese with some technological help, perhaps, for example, in materials technology, which may have enabled the Chinese to develop their hypersonic glide vehicle, which the US says they tested in August more quickly than the US had anticipated. So this naval exercise that took place in the Sea of Japan was a major event, and as I also discussed in a recent program, the United States attempted unsuccessfully to gate crash it, sending an Arleigh Burke destroyer to try and survey it, only for that Arleigh Burke destroyer to be chased away by a Russian warship. Anyway, that exercise, that naval exercise, was in itself big news, but what has followed is arguably bigger news still. And that is that directly following completion of that exercise, the warships that participated in it, both Chinese and Russian, went on their first ever joint maritime patrol sailing through the Tsugaru Strait in line close to Japan. And Global Times has provided an article which describes in detail the nature of this joint maritime patrol. And I will read it in full as follows. Right after China and Russia wrapped up a joint naval exercise in the Sea of Japan on Sunday, 10 powerful warships from the two countries switched to the next mission and sailed through the Tsugaru Strait into the Pacific Ocean on Monday in their first joint maritime patrol, which experts said on Tuesday could see the Joint Task Force encircle Japan or approach the United States. The joint patrol displays a high level of political and military mutual trust that exists between China and Russia in terms of safeguarding regional peace and stability at a time when the United States is ganging up with its allies like Japan and Australia and destabilizing the Asia-Pacific. The Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force spotted a joint flotilla consisting of 10 warships from China and Russia, namely the Type 055 guided missile destroyer Nanchang. This is the super destroyer, the top-of-the-line Chinese warship that I discussed both in my previous video and in this one. It is, as I said, the most advanced missile destroyer in the Chinese Navy. And to continue, the Type 052D guided missile destroyer Kunming, the Type 054A guided missile frigates Binzhao and Liuzhou, and the Type 903A comprehensive supply ship Dongpinghu, and the large anti-submarine ships from the Russian Navy, Admiral Panteleev and Admiral Tributs, the instrumentation ship Marshal Krylov, and the corvettes of the Project 20380 class, hero of the Russian Federation Aldar Tsidenjapov and Gromky. The warships passed through the Tsugaru Strait between Japan's main island of Honshu and Hokkaido and sailed toward the Pacific Ocean on Monday. This is the first time Chinese and Russian warships were seen transiting the Tsugaru Strait together. The Tsugaru Strait is not territorial waters, and warships from any country have the right to transit, which means the transit of the Chinese and Russian vessels is completely in line with international law and common practice. Many of the ships just completed the Joint Sea 2021 naval exercise in waters near Russia's Peter the Great Gulf, which started on Thursday and concluded on Sunday. The ships practiced more than 20 joint tasks, including mine defence, live fire artillery shooting, air defence, manoeuvring, communications and anti-submarine missions. The two countries' warships are apparently on their first strategic joint maritime patrol right after the joint drill. During the Joint Sea 2013, Chinese warships entered the Sea of Japan for the drills via the Tsugaru Strait, and after the drills, some participating vessels sailed through the Tsugaru Strait into the Pacific Ocean before returning to the East China Sea from the Mercouris Strait. This was the first time Chinese warships had encircled the Japanese archipelago. It is possible that the Chinese and Russian warships could encircle Japan again. Song Zhongping, a Chinese military expert and TV commentator, told Global Times. They could turn south and return to the East China Sea from the Miyako Strait or Ozumi Strait, which means an encirclement of Japan's main island, or they could turn north and again enter the Sea of Japan from the Tsugaru Strait, which means an encirclement of Japan's Hokkaido island. In August, a PLA flotilla led by the Nanchang destroyer reportedly sailed in international waters near the United States off the coast of the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. In June, Russian warships, including the hero of the Russian Federation Alda Tsidenjapov and the Gromky corvettes, practiced destroying a carrier strike group of a mock enemy off the coast of Hawaii. It is also possible that the Chinese warships will again approach the United States, said Shi Hung, executive editor of the Chinese magazine Shipborne Weapons. As the PLA Navy expands its Farsi training, there is no limit to where it can go as long as international law allows. China and Russia held two strategic joint aerial patrols in 2019 and 2020 in the Sea of Japan and the East China Sea, with a third one expected in 2021, which could feature more types of aircraft and a larger fleet. With the first strategic joint maritime patrol being held, such patrols could also become routine, and a joint aerial and maritime patrol could take place in the future. China and Russia have made many military interactions in 2021, including the Zapad Interaction 2021 strategic exercise held in China in August. That was a land exercise attended, by the way, by the Chinese and Russian defense ministers. I've discussed it in previous programs. At a time when the international situation is undergoing profound changes and the US is ganging up with allies like Japan and Australia and interfering in and destabilizing Asia-Pacific affairs, China and Russia must have countermeasures, enhance strategic cooperation, and boost the width and depth of their military exercises, said a Chinese military expert who requested anonymity. China and Russia displayed a stronger joint combat capability and a higher level of military cooperation, which is a warning to the United States and its allies. China and Russia are a key ballast stone to world peace and stability, and maintain the regional situation, and can deter Western countries led by the United States at a time when the United States is rallying up its allies in an attempt to maintain hegemony. So that's an account of the exercise from Global Times, or rather not an exercise, this maritime patrol drill. And notice that this is a very powerful fleet. It consists of 10 warships. The Chinese warships are significantly more powerful. They are led, as I said, by the top of the line super destroyer, the Type 055 destroyer Nanchang. But 2 of the Russian warships, Stereguchi-class corvettes, though smaller and much less powerful, are also modern warships, and the Russians have high ambitions to modernize their fleet. They're busy working out rebuilding their shipyards, and we could soon be seeing more advanced warships taking their place in the Russian Pacific Fleet before very long. And this article has pointedly reminded us that for 2 years now, 2 consecutive years now, the Russians and the Chinese have carried out joint air patrols over the Eastern Pacific. These are not exercises, these are actual patrols. Now they've carried out a joint naval patrol, and before long they might actually be combining the two so that we could see joint air and naval patrols by the Russians and the Chinese in the Eastern Pacific. As to all these speculations about whether this fleet is going to circumvent the Japanese home islands or is going to sail all the way to the US coast, I have no information about that one way or the other, and I don't propose to speculate about it. The mere fact that the Chinese and the Russians have for the first time ever engaged in a joint maritime patrol after they have engaged in joint air patrols, and that they're apparently planning to have a third joint air patrol over the Pacific within a few weeks, that is an important fact in itself. In fact, it is a critically important fact. It emphasizes the extent to which these 2 countries are now cooperating with each other in military affairs. It also, by the way, suggests that those training exercises, those maneuvers between Chinese and Russian warships are not just for show. The Russians and the Chinese are working now on creating joint task forces which are expected to operate out of area, that is to say, beyond the coastal waters of these 2 states. They're prepared to enter coastal waters or seas, international waters around Japan, perhaps even as far as the area close to the United States, but arguably, as the Chinese are saying in this Global Times article, anywhere in the world. And of course that has some rather extraordinary implications. Just imagine, for example, the effect of a joint Chinese-Russian task force operating in the Mediterranean, off the coast of Syria, for example. Or just imagine what the effect of a joint Russian-Chinese task force operating off the coast of Libya might have been in the event of an intervention like the one which took place in Libya, which NATO carried out back in 2011. Or just imagine again what might be the effect of a joint Russian-Chinese task force operating off the coast of Venezuela at a time when the United States might be thinking of making moves against that country. So this is a dramatic development. It is an extraordinary development. It emphasizes again that the strategic partnership between China and Russia is in fact a reality. It is, as the Chinese have said, not just an alliance. The Chinese, as I've discussed in previous programs, are talking about it as being something even better than an alliance. It is, in fact, a degree and level of military cooperation between the Russians and the Chinese, which, to my mind, the United States only engages in with countries that are part of the Five Eyes alliance. I think this goes beyond the kind of cooperation that the United States extends to some of its NATO allies, for example. Anyway, we have had more articles about this exercise from the Chinese. We've had another article from Global Times, which specifically talks about how this exercise is, how this exercise and this maritime patrol is a response to actions like the development of the AUKUS Pact. And I'm going to read this article also. The China-Russia joint naval drill that kicked off on Thursday in the Sea of Japan can counter AUKUS, the newly formed trilateral security partnership between the United States, Britain and Australia. It will further help Beijing and Moscow break through the US-led security containment. AUKUS will bring more unstable factors to the Western Pacific, since the trio may have more provocative actions. The US is trying to rope in more countries into the Western Pacific and Indo-Pacific regions to contain its strategic competitors. This may have a negative impact on China's maritime security. Against this backdrop, the China-Russia joint naval drill includes new subjects and displays high levels of mutual trust. China has a strong and reliable partner in the Western Pacific, which is Russia. This time, China has sent its most advanced 10,000-ton class Type 55 large destroyer, whilst Russia dispatched the main force of its Pacific fleet. This demonstrates that China and Russia attach great importance to defensive cooperation. In addition, the joint anti-submarine operations between China and Russia are worth people's attention. The People's Liberation Army Navy have sent multiple types of main battle equipment to the drills, including fixed-wing anti-submarine patrol aircraft. This year, the United States has increased spy ship activities in the South China Sea. By demonstrating joint anti-submarine capabilities, China and Russia have sent a warning to the United States. The United States nuclear submarines should not act rashly at the doorsteps of China and Russia, especially in the Western Pacific. In other words, if the United States wants to conduct a strategic blockade and siege, China and Russia will be likely to coordinate their stances or integrate the power of both countries. It's an extraordinary statement, by the way. Integrate the power of both countries. More than an alliance? Combined forces? Anyway, to continue. This way, they aim to break the US strategic blockade and military encirclement, as well as to completely crash its attempt to use AUKUS for strategic containment. What Washington wants is to stir up trouble in China's neighbouring countries. In this context, Moscow can coordinate with Beijing to counter AUKUS because China and Russia take a responsible approach to affairs in the Western Pacific region. They can coordinate their positions to speak out together in the face of US military hegemony on the sea. For example, in August, the Type 055 destroyer reportedly sailed in international waters near Alaska. Some analysts believe this time there is a possibility of the destroyer approaching the United States again. Maybe it will, and maybe it will have Russian warships as part of its task force. That's what that previous article was telling us. In any case, the People's Liberation Army Navy's activities will always be reasonable and legal. The Pacific is not the sphere of influence exclusive to the United States. To maintain its strategic interests, the Chinese Navy needs to enter the deep ocean, such as in-depth areas, to exercise and practice its combat capability. It should make response plans to prevent the US military from disturbing its normal exercises. AUKUS keeps challenging strategic competitors such as China and Russia, but it is not capable of counterbalancing China and Russia at the same time. Britain's defence expenditures determine that it cannot afford to deploy a major maritime force in Asia for a long time. In fact, the main objective of Britain is still in the Atlantic. The United States wants to set up a benchmark in its alliance system by taking advantage of AUKUS. More precisely, it wants to create a small clique within its broader military alliance system. Under such circumstances, China and Russia will boost their own national strength and military capabilities in the first place, and then engage in active strategic deterrence. Besides, they can coordinate more on international occasions. They can reveal Washington's plots when the United States woos allies to create military alliances and coerce other countries. In defence, China and Russia can cooperate more and display their strength and determination to maintain stability in the Asia-Pacific. That China and Russia, with considerable military strengths, join hands to show their stance serves as a counterbalance to AUKUS. Now, this is actually an extraordinarily interesting article. It leaves many clues as to Chinese and arguably Russian thinking, and it says more than it appears to. Firstly, note the way the article harps on AUKUS. It specifically talks about this the US-British-Australian partnership, and it suggests that the United States is now looking, in effect, beyond NATO and beyond its other regional alliances in order to forge an alliance system which is going to be based more on the Five Eyes allies: the United States, Britain, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. New Zealand, so far, it must be said, is a reluctant partner, rather than relying on its more far-flung allies like NATO and groupings like the Quad. It's already indicated through its submarine deal, the submarine deal with Australia, that it regards France as an unreliable ally in the Pacific. So there's some hint about this, and that the real adversary of the Chinese and the Russians will not be NATO, will not be the Quad, it will be AUKUS, it'll be the Five Eyes alliance. In other words, the core alliance of English-speaking countries which are at the centre of the US alliance system. So there is this constant harping on AUKUS, which is in fact the apparent enemy or adversary that's been talked about in this article. But notice also the extraordinary stress on anti-submarine warfare. There's an enormous amount here about how the Chinese and the Russians are now carrying out drills in anti-submarine operations. So the joint anti-submarine operations between China and Russia are worth people's attention. The People's Liberation Army Navy have sent multiple types of main battle equipment to the drills, including fixed-wing anti-submarine patrol aircraft. China and Russia have sent a warning to the United States. US nuclear submarines should not act rashly at the doorsteps of China and Russia, especially in the Western Pacific. If the United States wants to conduct strategic blockade and siege, China and Russia will likely coordinate their stances and integrate the power of their countries. Now, the point about all of this is that, of course, AUKUS, let's remember, started as part of a nuclear submarine deal. The United States and Britain have committed themselves to provide Australia with technology so that Australia can build nuclear submarines, a fleet of 8 of them, no less. Now, many people, Scott Ritter, for example, are sceptical about whether those Australian submarines will ever be built or whether they will appear in any practical time frame. But the fact is that it is nuclear submarines that appear to be very much at the forefront of thinking of the author of this particular article, which has appeared in Global Times. And of course, all of this comes a short time after that somewhat mysterious incident of the US Seawolf class nuclear submarine, the USS Chaffee, which seems to have been involved in some kind of collision in the South China Sea. And as I discussed in a recent program, the Chinese have gone out of their way in response to that incident to make it clear that they are aware of the fact that US nuclear submarines now routinely patrol the South China Sea and plant monitoring devices there. So the Chinese have indicated that they're very well aware of what the Americans are doing in the South China Sea. And I'm sure that they're well aware of what the Americans are doing elsewhere. But it's also almost certainly the case that though the Chinese have been making great strides in their submarine warfare capabilities, this is one area where their technology and their capabilities are well behind those of Russia. The Russians, after all, have been operating nuclear submarines since the 1950s, or in practical terms since the 1960s. They have massive experience in nuclear submarine technology and in nuclear submarine warfare and in sonar technology and in all types of areas of battle under the world ocean. And by some accounts, Russia's Yasen-M submarines, nuclear submarines, are the most advanced in the world, at least in terms of attack submarines, though I'm sure there are people in Britain and the United States who will disagree with that assessment. But having said that, I don't think there's any doubt that Russian Yasen-M class submarines are much more advanced than Chinese nuclear submarines. The Chinese have the much more powerful surface fleet than the Russians. The Russians have the more advanced and sophisticated nuclear submarine fleet. And one gets a sense that what the author of this article is hinting at is that the Russians are going to help the Chinese with anti-submarine warfare in the Pacific, so that the Russians will be able to provide the Chinese with their very highly developed submarine technology and obviously submarine monitoring technology, because a country that operates nuclear submarines and has done so for decades has developed enormous skills in monitoring and tracking the nuclear submarines of the other side. So it looks as if the Chinese, who are well behind the Russians, as I said, in nuclear submarine technology, are looking to work with the Russians to develop nuclear submarine technology and develop nuclear submarine tracking technology in order to keep abreast of what US nuclear submarines are doing in the Pacific. And not just, of course, US nuclear submarines, but those of nuclear submarines of other potential powers like Australia, on the assumption that these Australian nuclear submarines we've been hearing so much about are ever built. And that, I have to say, is, I suspect from an American point of view, a very alarming development. If China and Russia are going to start sharing technologies and capabilities, and I come back to that very interesting comment about how, in the article, about how China and Russia will likely coordinate their stances or integrate the power of both countries. If China and Russia start sharing naval technology in a big scale, so that the Chinese, for example, help the Russians enhance and upgrade their surface fleet and the Russians help the Chinese develop and enhance their underwater fleet, then of course this is a formidable competition that the United States could be facing. I mean, to give some examples, not only would the United States be facing a challenge from Russian nuclear submarines in the North Atlantic and the Arctic, but it could also find that its own deployment of nuclear submarines in places like the South China Sea is going to start to become much more problematic and much more difficult. And it could also find that the Chinese nuclear submarine forces are rapidly developing in capability also. And of course there's something else, because of course the Russians do have a very ambitious naval construction program to enhance their surface ship fleet, though at the moment it's very much in its early stages. They've built some very advanced and very powerful Corvette-class warships. The United States and the Western powers would classify these Russian corvettes as frigates, but the Russians are known to have plans to build destroyer-class warships, apparently of about 8,000 to 10,000 tons. There's apparently a shipyard being built in St. Petersburg, which could be big enough to build warships of that size. And there is some talk always about the Russians perhaps one day building their own aircraft carriers. And there's been a major construction program in the Pacific by the Russians in an area of Kamchatka, the Kamchatka Peninsula. They're building a gigantic shipyard there, the Bolshoi Carmen shipyard, and there is some speculation that that could be used to build aircraft carriers. I have to say, I'm not entirely convinced that's the case. It's always seemed to me that the Bolshoi Carmen shipyard looks to me more like a shipyard intended to upgrade Russia's merchant marine, but then you never know. And it's undoubtedly the case that the big Russian shipyards in the Arctic, which do seem to be mainly focused on naval construction, they're being upgraded also. So it's possible that just as the Chinese might get submarine warfare technology from the Russians, nuclear submarine warfare from the Russians might get help from the Chinese or advice from the Chinese about how to upgrade and build up their surface fleet. And of course, if the Russians really are planning to build a destroyer, a big destroyer, a 10,000-ton destroyer, similar in size, in other words, to the Nanchang, the Type 055 class destroyer that the Chinese are operating, well, then any advice from the Chinese on how to operate and build such a warship would undoubtedly be welcome. So we'll see whether or not that is indeed what the Russians and the Chinese are up to. And then there's another thing which this article also hints at, because we see that the article talks about the Russians deploying major military, the Russians and the Chinese deploying jointly naval task forces to coordinate more on international occasions. Does that mean international crises? Well, I discussed earlier in this program what the effect of a joint Russian-Chinese task force off the coast of Libya in 2011 might have been, the effect it might have had, and what the effect such a joint Chinese-Russian task force might have in a future crisis. Well, this article appears to hint at that future possibility. All very concerning, I would guess, for the United States. Anyway, inevitably, there's been some political and diplomatic pushback from the United States in response to all of this. And we've had, in particular, some rather pointed questions addressed to the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman about this the operation of this joint task force, and they came from Bloomberg at the regular press conference at the Chinese Foreign Ministry. And I'm going to read the question and the answer, and then the response from Global Times. And the question from Bloomberg was as follows. 10 Chinese and Russian warships on Monday passed through the Tsugaru Strait between Japan's Honshu and Hokkaido for the first time. Could you please explain the purpose of the transit? Secondly, the Taiwan Strait and the Tsugaru Strait are both legally international waters, meaning that warships are allowed to sail through them. Yet China argues that the Taiwan Strait transits earlier this week are vile. So I was curious to know how these two situations are different or similar. And the Chinese spokesman, Wang Wenbin, responded as follows. Regarding your first question, please refer it to the Ministry of National Defense. On your second question, the international community sees clearly who are flexing their muscles, provoking and stirring up trouble, and who, under the disguise of freedom of navigation, are conducting military deterrence and undermining regional peace and stability. A very, shall we say, an answer that isn't really an answer. But we've had, to that question from Bloomberg, a much sharper response from, inevitably, Global Times. And it comes in the form of editorial, and the editorial says the following. Taiwan Straits is no Tsugaru Strait. US warship passage will never be legalized. And the Global Times editorial reads as follows. During the Chinese Foreign Ministry's routine press conference on Tuesday, Western media provocatively asked that since Chinese and Russian warships on Monday passed through the Tsugaru Strait between two Japanese islands, how is it different from foreign warships sailing through the Taiwan Straits? US politicians and military leaders have already made lame arguments with perverted logic, but US media reporters are also pretending to be ignorant, comparing the completely different situations between the Tsugaru Strait and the Taiwan Straits. They're trying to provide public opinion support for the United States' roping in allied warships to show off force in the Taiwan Straits. This shows depravity of Western media outlets. The situation in the Tsugaru Strait is, of course, fundamentally different from that in the Taiwan Straits. As is well known to all, the Tsugaru Strait is between Japan's Honshu and Hokkaido, which is 24 to 40 kilometers wide. In order to facilitate the transit of US warships, Japan took special measures to reduce its territorial waters in this water area from 12 nautical miles to 3 nautical miles. The middle part of the strait is opened as international waters, and ships and warships of various countries have the right of innocent passage. The middle part of the Taiwan Strait is also an international waterway. All countries' ships and warships have the right of innocent passage. However, the significant difference is that the situation in the Tsugaru Strait is highly stable. There are no disputes or hidden dangers of confrontation between the two sides of the strait, whilst the Taiwan Strait is one of the most politically and militarily tense areas in the world today. The two sides of the Taiwan Straits are in fierce struggle of secession and anti-secession. Chinese and Russian warships passing through the Tsugaru Straits is in full compliance with international law's definition of innocent passage. Although both China and Russia have territorial disputes with Japan, the Tsugaru Strait is far away from the two disputed areas, the Diaoyu Islands and the southern Kurils. By passing through the Tsugaru Strait, Chinese and Russian warships did not specifically target the relevant territorial disputes. Actually, after the Chinese and Russian warships sailed through the Tsugaru Straits, some radicals in Japan blustered on the internet. But few of them have linked the sailing issue with matters of the Diaoyu and southern Kurils. The purpose of the United States in roping in its allies to sail through the Taiwan Straits is to show off its strength to the Chinese mainland and stimulate the Taiwan secessionist forces. The political consequences of intensifying regional tensions are obvious. Furthermore, the frequent passage of US vessels through the Taiwan Straits has also increased the mutual hostility between the United States military and the People's Liberation Army. This constitutes one of the severe risks of misfire due to miscalculations or accidents. Some Western public opinion tried to legitimize the provocative activities of US warships in the Taiwan Straits by hyping the passage of Chinese and Russian warships through the Tsugaru Straits. But it is believed that the international community will not be fooled. It does not lack the discernment to distinguish between two different kinds of passage. Such a comparison provides an opportunity for the public in the globe to see exactly what innocent passage is and what is a show of force and hegemony in the name of freedom of navigation. China's reunification must be completed. The definition of one China is shaped by Chinese history, general principles of world politics, and the strong aspirations of 1.4 billion Chinese people. Taiwan's Democratic Progress Party authority cannot deny it. Washington cannot tamper with it. The struggle in the Taiwan Straits may have its climaxes, but its ending has long been determined by history. The passage of US warships will eventually prove to be clownish in this historical drama. Well, some rather purple passages in that editorial. I think the point it's making actually is a valid one. Yes, the Taiwan Straits are in international waters, at least some parts of them are, just as the Tsugaru Straits are international waters. But there really isn't any comparison. The situation in the Tsugaru Straits is stable. The situation in the Taiwan Straits is not. Chinese and Russian warships steaming through the Tsugaru Straits is not going to change the geopolitical picture. US warships steaming through the Taiwan Straits is a clear warning and threat to China and a clear show of force in support of Taiwan. So there is a difference, and the Chinese and Global Times are right to say it. I do have to say, however, that the Chinese, of course, are, in my opinion, perhaps protesting just a little too much. I don't dispute the essence, the essential point that they're making, that there are key differences between the situation in the Tsugaru Straits and in the Taiwan Straits. But nonetheless, it is undeniable, I think, that this Chinese and Russian task force sailing through the Tsugaru Strait is also intended to be a show of force. And it's a show of force, obviously targeted at the United States, and it is a show of force also targeted at Japan. And if this task force does steam all the way to the US coast, or close to the US coast, then of course that show of force these implications at least will only be further redoubled. So, let's be a little skeptical about some of these comments, which is not to say, as I said, that the Chinese aren't making some valid contrasts between the Tsugaru Strait and the Taiwan Strait. Anyway, let's put all that aside and ask ourselves a few questions, or at least consider the implications of all of this. Here we see a whole succession of joint exercises being carried out by the Chinese and the Russians. We've had joint naval exercises now, we've had joint land exercises, we've had joint aircraft exercises. That's a serious enough issue in itself, especially given the fact that the Chinese and the Russians are now clearly sharing classified secrets about their respective technologies. We know that the Russians have provided the Chinese with technical know-how to enable the Chinese to develop their early warning radar system to protect themselves from American attacks, to provide themselves with early warning of an American strategic attack. We know that because no less a person than President Putin himself told us as much. We now have growing signs that the Chinese and the Russians are sharing technology, or at least technological secrets, in many other fields too. After all, they have issued communiques and statements and documents which talk about technology sharing, but we are starting, perhaps, just possibly, to see more hints of where all this is going. We saw that hypersonic glide vehicle test. I am going to take that test as something which actually happened. There have been more Chinese comments about this. When you drill down into them, it's quite clear that they're not actually denials. And in fact, I'm quite confident that this test did actually take place. It's possible, I don't say it's proven, that the Russians provided the Chinese with some technical know-how about how to do it. The Russians have already deployed a hypersonic glide vehicle warhead on their intercontinental ballistic missiles. It's not impossible that they've shared some of that technology with the Chinese. We also see the Chinese and the Russians working together, possibly to share technology on stealth fighter development. The Russians have a long history, of course, of selling military aircraft to China, including advanced jet aircraft, and they seem to have been providing the Chinese with fighter jet technology for some time. But it's possible that things are now going beyond that, and the Russians have been given information about the Chinese J-20 stealth fighter jet, and it's possible that the Russians are also providing the Chinese with information, conceivably with information, about their Sukhoi 57 stealth fighter jet in return. Who knows? And we see that the Chinese are also providing the Russians with access to their top-of-the-line Type 055 super destroyer, and this is happening at the same time that the Russians are building a shipyard in St. Petersburg, which appears to be intended to build a super destroyer of the same size and power. And we also see articles appearing, like the one I've just read from Global Times, which appear to hint at cooperation between the Chinese and Russians in anti-submarine warfare technology too. So lots of indications of technology sharing. And on top of that, we see that the Chinese and the Russians are not just exercising together, they're not just sharing technologies, which is a serious and big matter in itself. They are now busy carrying out joint combat patrols. I say combat patrols because though these task forces and air groups which have carried out joint patrols together have not actually engaged in combat, they are designed or trained to do precisely that. We've had 2 occasions when the Chinese and Russian air forces have engaged in joint air patrols. We now learn that there's going to be a 3rd such instance later this year, and we've now seen the first joint naval patrol carried out directly after and consequent upon joint naval drills between the Chinese and Russian navies. And we've had a series of articles from Global Times in which they tell us that these naval task forces, these joint task forces, might circumvent the Japanese islands, might sail all the way to the western coast of the United States, and might in future be deployed or operate together in the event of international occasions, which seems to be some kind of euphemism for international crises. And we see other articles appearing in Global Times which talk about the Chinese and the Russians integrating their combat power. Well, this is all, I would say, extremely concerning stuff, or at least if I was a Pentagon planner, it would be extremely concerning stuff, because it's quite clear that just as the United States appears to be edging towards integrating even more tightly the Five Eyes allies, the English-speaking allies that form the core of the US alliance system, into some sort of joint military force, so the Russians and the Chinese are apparently taking the first steps to do the same thing. Except, of course, that there is a difference, which is that the United States is obviously a military superpower, but Britain, Australia, Canada and New Zealand are not, whereas China and Russia are both military superpowers. And given that this is so, the military capabilities of combined forces of the Russian-Chinese strategic partnership, let's continue to call it that for the moment, would potentially be an order of magnitude greater than the joint military forces of the various countries that make up the Five Eyes alliance. Well, is that going to happen? Will we actually see the Chinese and the Russians integrating their military forces in that kind of way? Well, I think one point I'm going to make straight away is that these are all Chinese articles which I have read. I've not seen anything analogous in any Russian military or diplomatic or political journal. The Russians, for the moment, are not talking about integrating their forces with the Chinese to the same degree. But what the Russians are doing is perhaps doing what they so often do, taking actions which speak louder than words. I've talked already about technology transfers, and for what it's worth, I'm pretty confident that they're happening on something like the scale I have said, and perhaps on an even greater scale than that which I have said. And of course, it is a fact that they are indeed engaging with the Chinese in these joint exercises, and that they are now participating in these joint patrols. So far, up to now, these have all happened in the Asia-Pacific region. But of course, the Russians are involved in bitter conflicts with NATO and with the Western alliance in Europe. And one does wonder what will happen if, before very long, we start to see the Chinese reciprocating with these joint drills and exercises that the Russians are conducting alongside the Chinese in the Pacific, if the Chinese reciprocate by carrying out similar exercises in Europe. let's say, in the Arctic, where the Chinese already are cooperating increasingly with the Russians on economic and natural resource questions. Well, we might not be quite there yet, and I suspect the reason for that is that both the Chinese and the Russians, especially the Chinese at the moment, perhaps do not want to cause too much alarm in Europe. They don't particularly want to cause too much concern in one particular European country, which is Germany, which the Chinese at the moment are making a big effort to try and woo. And it may be that that's what's restraining the Chinese and the Russians from these joint exercises and joint air and naval patrols in the European regions. But it's possible that they will come. And bear in mind that the Russians have been working very hard recently to develop the Northern Sea Route. That's to say, make it possible to navigate along Russia's Arctic coast through all seasons of the year, including in winter. They're busy building a fleet of exceptionally powerful nuclear-powered icebreakers to make that possible. And of course, there's also the global warming issue, which supposedly will make that easier also. So if all that works out as planned or as intended, then it's possible, indeed it's highly likely, I would say it's almost a bankable certainty that we will start to see Chinese warships sailing along the sea route, Northern Sea Route, across Russia's Arctic coast, all the way to the North Atlantic, to the Atlantic region, the Arctic regions, where they would, of course, have a dramatic potential impact in the naval balance. I would also add that the opening of the Arctic Sea Route, as well as its undoubted commercial advantages, would enable the Russians to do something that they have never been able to do previously in their history, which is to send warships from their northern fleet bases, the bases that project towards the Atlantic, to send warships to the Pacific and vice versa, and do so whilst remaining within Russian territorial waters. It's not something the Russians have ever been able to do before. It would provide them with that ability to move naval forces around between the Pacific and the Atlantic in a way that they've never been able to do in the past, duplicating, to a certain degree, a capability that the United States has had ever since it built the Panama Canal. So, there we go. Very interesting developments in naval warfare. I'm going to finish this article by saying that all of this remains very much in its infancy. I suspect, as I said, that technological exchanges between the Russians and the Chinese are very extensive, much more extensive than is being admitted, though the Chinese are now increasingly hinting at the extent of them. But the military integration is still at a relatively early stage. Having said that, it's perhaps also important to say that whilst Russian-Chinese military forces already exceed, by orders of magnitude, the potential capabilities of the Five Eyes alliance. If we're talking about nuclear submarines, the Russians, of course, already have them. Australia has not. Australia is perhaps unlikely to obtain them, whereas, of course, as I said, the Russians have them already. So if we start to see Chinese and Russian interchange of technologies in submarine warfare, then that will accelerate a nuclear submarine build-up by China in the Pacific, which AUKUS cannot possibly match. And it may be that this deployment of the Russian-Chinese naval force in the Tsugaru Strait is a warning, intended as a warning to Japan, which is one country that could develop and deploy nuclear submarines quite quickly, that if it does that, it has a potential fight on its hands, and it might be as intended as a kind of warning to the Japanese. But anyway, these are, as I said, early developments for the moment. There's the potential for the Russians and the Chinese to move ahead with it, and the likelihood that they will is very great, and the effect of them doing so would be potentially enormous. Now, what does the United States do? Well, it seems to me that the United States needs to understand that it is its own policies that have created this situation. If we go back to the start of this century, to the year 2000, at that time, though the Russians and the Chinese had cordial relations, they certainly did not see themselves as the kind of allies that they do now, and that he certainly did not envisage at that time that they would be aligned with each other against the United States. On the contrary, at that time, in the year 2000, for China and for Russia, relations with the United States was more important for each of these countries than was relations with each other. Now, that situation, that calculus has changed entirely, and it has changed entirely largely because of the way in which the Chinese and the Russians feel themselves under pressure from US policy. Now, there have been increasing numbers of articles appearing in the US think tank media about the enormous strategic crisis this potentially presents for the United States. And we've seen with his joint naval patrol further indications of how this crisis is developing. And if we see the Chinese and the Russians sharing know-how and technology in naval construction and in submarine and surface fleet developments, that's going to become even worse. Well, it's clear, it seems to me, that the Americans, those Americans who are worried about these developments are right to be worried. But if the United States is going to respond to this intelligently, then it needs to understand that piling on the pressure on the Chinese and the Russians, especially piling on that pressure on the Russians, is not going to solve the problem. Because it was that pressure in the first place which has driven the Chinese and the Russians together to the extent that they're engaging in technology transfer, joint military patrols, joint exercises. Now, as I said, in program after program, there seems to be enormous difficulty in Washington in understanding this. And one wonders whether the United States is capable of understanding it or adjusting to it. But if it doesn't, we've seen with these joint maritime patrols, with these joint aircraft aviation patrols that the Russians and the Chinese are engaged in, the shape of things to come. Well, thank you for joining me again for this program today on this topic. I look forward to you joining me again in future for future programs on this channel. Please also remember to join us on the Duran for future programs, the programs which I do with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. And please also remember to check out Alex's channel. You will find links under this video. Please also remember to check us out on Locals. We're doing an enormous amount of work there. We have lots of things going on Locals. We're publishing exclusive content, exclusive videos in which we look into many of these questions that we've discussed, including the sort of questions we've discussed today on this program. You'll find exclusive content on Locals in which we look into all of that in more detail. You can also find lots of activity by other members of our community on Locals. So please come to us on Locals, join us there, learn more things there, contribute to things there. We learn so much from you when you comment on Locals, posting your own articles, linking to them, providing us with information. And also, you can find us on other platforms also, BitChute, Library, Rumble, Odyssey, and the rest, and of course, especially the new free speech platform, SuperU. Also, if you want to support us in the hard work we do, well, you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, buying the wonderful things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all the rest. And of course, you can also help us by making sure that you have a subscription to this channel. So please check your subscription and please tick the like button to this video if you've liked it. Well, thank you for joining me today. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a wonderful day. Until then.